So here we are. How is Athenian radical democracy different than democracy today in the USA? Democracy stops at the representative level with the republic or representative democracy, right? We vote for the representatives and then it stops. Then they are the ones who call the shots. It's almost the opposite than what was going on in Athens in a way, because in Athens, you would actually have a council of 400 to 500 known as the boule, kind of like a senate, who would decide what matters the assembly would vote on. And so the assembly could decide, yes or no, or they could be at one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum. The Senate doesn't have control of it necessarily. So it could go against the will of the Senate, the assembly. But the idea is that when a policy is made, it's the masses that directly vote on it. But in where we live, we vote almost like we vote for the boule or the Senate, and then they get together and vote on it. You see how it's the opposite there? It's flipped. So in other words, in democratic Athens, it's a council of 500 that determines the bills, and then it's the citizens who determine what happens with it. Just the opposite here. It's the masses who determine the people who do the voting. We don't actually vote on the actual agendas, unless we're talking local matters, of course, which is maybe where we should focus when it comes to voting power. But really, when you think about the boule, the way Solon set it up, you're actually taking tribal heads and you're choosing single tribal heads that represent each single tribe. So your boule might be made up as tribal heads more than anything else. We're a representative democracy. We vote for people to vote for us. Whereas literally in Athens, they had a direct democracy. So let's keep going. What are negative and positive aspects of radical democracy? Because we think of like a leader of a corporation. If that person's rash, then we get really worried. But when we think of a council of people, we don't worry if they're rash. But groups and mobs and masses of people, we know if you actually study history, it's called a mob mentality. Masses can easily be manipulated. And this is at the heart of one of the flaws of radical democracy. Talk about persuasion now. Why is that so important at this time? If we have radical democracy, and it's the actual people who are directly voting, then they can be directly manipulated. And if they're voting in one day, in other words, they're not going home and coming back a week later to vote, to think about it, you know that a good speaker can get your emotions stirred up, and it might take a couple days to come back down from it, to become less radical, to become less fixated on a new diet trend. Or you go to church on Sunday or Saturday or whenever you go to church, and you're filled with the Holy Spirit for the next 2 days, but then by Wednesday, you have totally different feeling about things. So you have to go back to church Wednesday night, right? The ability to persuade one person, we know about, right? You can persuade one person to make a change, like a king or a leader, but a lot of us don't know how fickle and easy and persuasive a huge group of people can be. Humans are very interesting. Humans are a special creature. They're not perfect. They're a specific thing. We like to think because we're humans that we're kind of a neutral, like an empty canvas that needs to be painted by culture and that sort of thing. But no, there are certain things to the human mind that are predictable. And it goes to the heart of radical democracy. And it's that the masses can be very, very fickle. Here's an example. A demagogue means a leader of the people. And it's generally a derogatory term in the ancient world. You can convince large crowds to make decisions that you want them to make. And so in your time of radical democracy, the most potent form of democracy, the most celebrated form of democracy, even though it has great flaws and we'd never do it again, the main problem and where it falls down is that if you give power to the masses, what happens when you give power to the masses? The masses. I don't mean like people who understand government, I just mean everyday everyone. Laborers, white collar, blue collar, everyone. What do they do if they're easily influenced? And I think my main point is that Cleon was your first demagogue, and Thucydides said that Cleon was the first one who would go on stage and scream at people. He would go on stage and accuse people of things, make them feel bad for being bad Athenians. In the past, it was the aristocratic leader who was supposed to speak benevolently, a benevolent father figure, a patriarchal benevolent father figure. But then that was the habit with speakers. They would try to stroke the ego of the audience. Cleon comes along, and of course think they have robes and everything. Cleon would come onto the stage and pick his skirt up so he can move around quickly. He'd pick his skirt up and then, run across the stage back and forth, really animated, and like scream and yell at people. Well, they weren't accustomed to that. Of course, in Greece at this time, people were loud and they'd speak over each other, but they weren't accustomed to somebody who was on stage trying to persuade them to be yelling at them and making them feel bad, and then making them feel like there's a way to redeem themselves, and then convince them of doing something to negate those poor feelings. Right? So when you get somebody who's highly persuasive, in this era, the art of persuasion, sophistry was building to one of the highest peaks it's ever been. We study the writings of Aristotle still when we want to become a good speaker, when we want to practice debate. It's still the great authors of this time who teach us about persuasion. If you go to advanced speaking course, you're going to learn about Aristotle, ethos, pathos, and logos, right from the book of Aristotle. And so the real problem is to go back to my big question, is what happens when the masses are given radical democracy is they give it away. The people, the masses, will convince themselves, or at least a majority of them, that a specific leader who carries with him, they're symbolically representative of either your city-state or the problems that you're currently having or the fears that you currently have. They talk about the things you're angry at. They talk about the things you're sad at. And so you identify that demagogue as somebody who stands for the will of the people and somebody who stands for the will of your, say, city-state or nation in modern terms. So Cleon would really stir people's emotions up, and he would convince them to do these things. And Cleon really had a violent temper, and he was violent. And he would convince Athenians to, when they were really at the height of their empire, they were sort of exploiting their neighbors in their most democratic phase, which is also another irony there. And Cleon once convinced the Athenians that because an island, Mytilene, revolted, that Athenians should immediately go out, and this is in the assembly, they're getting ready to vote on this. Cleon is yelling and screaming at Athenians that they need to go out and immediately repress the revolt, kill the males, and sell all the women and children into slavery. And Athenians are like, yeah, let's do that, because they revolted and we're starting an empire, and we can't let Mytilene begin a negative precedent. All the other islands and territories will start revolting. So the people get stirred up and they're like, yep, let's do it. Let's kill all the males and sell all the women and children into slavery. And so they got on their boats, their triremes, to sail off. The triremes left it. And the next day rolls around. Athenian male citizens wake up and they feel really bad that they just basically voted to have Mytilene wiped out, to have all the men killed. And they all felt bad. So that shows you the art of persuasion, how potent it is, not just at this time, but any time, that Cleon could convince them to murder the males on an entire island and sell the females and children into slavery. And this is illustrative because they woke up the next morning and changed their mind. So that's one of the negative aspects of radical democracy. That's actually two of them. It is that the masses can be easily persuaded by somebody who's persuasive, or at least charismatic. And number two, they change their mind too much. That's something you don't want in a war. You don't want to constantly change your mind. They can be persuaded way too easily. They give their power away to a demagogue almost every time. They give their power away. They say, we don't want to make the decisions anymore. We want to have this guy like Pericles or Cleon make all the decisions. They want to give their power away once they get it. Of course, we've never experienced that, right? We've never had full democratic power that we could give away. And fickle and changing masses, right? That next day, when they woke up, they sent a boat out at double speed to catch up with the triremes, and they stopped them right before the massacre began. And so that's an interesting illustration of the persuasive nature of the masses. What are negative and positive aspects of radical democracy? Let's just go through them real quick. Pure democracy is one vote equals one vote. Ideally, it means we're all equal and we all have an equal say. Not that Athenians, you had to be a male citizen, of course, but you get the idea. In the USA, we have a popular vote. The popular vote doesn't really count when we vote for the president, but we still count it anyway. Radical democracy, like we see with the dismantling of the temples and government structures, they're taking power away from aristocrats. So now you can be elected or chosen by lot to serve, and you don't have to be an aristocrat. It takes privilege away. I mean, that's what the French Revolution was all about. You know, the French Revolution was like, aristocrats and clergy don't even have to pay taxes. All the burden is on the working classes and the poor. That's ridiculous, you know? You want to take that privilege away. That had a lot to do with the French Revolution, 1789, not just Athens. Negative aspects, the citizen masses can be easily manipulated or caught up in emotional responses. Cleon the Demagogue, Thucydides 421. The citizen masses can make rash decisions and change their mind soon after casting their vote. The case of Mytilene. One day they vote to wipe out all the males on Mytilene. Next day they change their mind. Wow, life and death held lightly. And another aspect, in times of war and emergency, are often met with confusion and argument. When the United States formed as a nation, this is at the heart of what they were discussing. Democratic Athens, but also Republican Rome. The United States formed their government already knowing the flaws of radical democracy. They chose a republic instead, a representative government. Something that the Romans had for a little while, and they took great pride in. So the USA is a little bit more like the Romans than the Athenians in the classical era.